Hey, what's up, guys? I just wanted to make this quick response. Hopefully, it's a quick response to Scott's latest video. This is also in conjunction with my last response to Scott and his most recent series of videos towards William Lane Craig. And again, I want to, if you watch my last video, I attacked his causal principle, the principle that undergirds that syllogism he presented to William Lane Craig, or the one that William Lane Craig dealt with on his website. So anyways, let me get into this. And again, if you're familiar with the other videos, you'll know what I'm talking about. So I want to go in after his causal principle. And his causal principle states, where nothing is affected, no effect shall obtain. And this is why Scott says that God cannot create ex nihilo, because there's nothing for God to affect. And what follows from this is that if there was something for God to affect, Creatio Ex Nihilo is falsified. And that's what I want to attack here. Because I think there's a difference between an interaction with some X and a rearrangement of that interaction. And I think Scott is equivocating on this too. So let's look at what Creatio Ex Nihilo actually is. And this is a really good definition that I found. And it makes sense. And I think this is what theists are trying to say when God created the universe ex nihilo. This is what they mean. In technically theological and philosophical use, Creatio Ex Nihilo expresses the act whereby God brings the entire substance of a thing into existence from a state of non-existence. All Creatio Ex Nihilo is God bringing the entire substance of a thing from non-existence into existence. It doesn't really get into interactions or anything like that. However, one type of interaction would falsify that, and this is what we got to make a distinction on. If a particular interaction is a rearrangement, if God interacts with some X and rearranges that X into the universe, that would falsify Creatio Ex Nihilo. But that's my point. Just because God interacts with something does not mean a rearrangement has occurred. So Scott's causal principle does not falsify Creatio Ex Nihilo in the sense of God bringing an entire substance of a thing into existence. The only way it would falsify it is if God rearranged something in that interaction into the universe. But an interaction does not logically entail a rearrangement has occurred. For Scott to show that an interaction falsifies Creatio Ex Nihilo, he's got to show that every time an interaction takes place, a rearrangement is logically follows, and that simply can't be done. And I want to also reference, I don't have the notations with me right now, but Scott should know what I'm talking about. And any of you guys, if you go look on his latest video, there should be a link to a debate between William Lane Craig and Quentin Smith. And they're talking about definitions of causality and whatnot. And nobody seems, throughout the history of philosophy, nobody can seem to agree of a perfect definition or a final definition of causality. However, Quentin Smith says that there's one thing that all of those definitions have in common, and it's the fact that the effect does not logically follow from the cause. So basically what that's saying is you can have an interaction between X and Y, and whatever effect obtains from that does not logically follow. Logic cannot dictate what the effect will be. So if let's say God interacts with something, logic does not dictate that that interaction will produce a rearrangement. So try not to get ahead of myself here. Just because God interacts with something does not mean it's not a Creatio Ex Nihilo. Because God can interact with something and produce a completely different substance. Logically speaking, there's nothing barring that from happening. And Scott or anybody else might want to raise an objection that they'd like to see an example of this in nature. And I'd like to point out in this video that I'm not attacking. I'm attacking his logical objection. This is not an inductive statement I'm making. I'm not referring to anything we see in nature. I'm saying it's logically possible that an interaction can produce some completely new substance. So I hope I'm making sense with this. A couple other things Scott says in his video is he attacks William Lane Craig's metaphysical first principle whatever begins to exist has a cause, which is tied into a deeper principle. Out of nothing, nothing comes. Being cannot come from non-being. And Scott basically reduces this principle to something we observe in nature. And I want to object to that. I want to say that something like this is more, I would say when we think about being, not being able to come from non-being, it's a conceptual analysis. It's not like we're looking out at nature and coming to this conclusion. We're conceptually analyzing the nature of being, that's a metaphysical analyzation. It's not, we're not looking at something in nature and inferring this. Although things in nature would affirm it, but I think when we think about being and non-being, it's something that's purely conceptual. And it's something that's the only way it can be analyzed. It's not something we experience, so to speak. And again, when we look at nature, it affirms that principle, but I don't think the principle itself comes from any specific example we see in nature. I just think that nature affirms that. So I don't agree that this principle is purely inductive. It's purely something we've experienced, and that's the only way we've come to understand it. I think it's something that's conceptually analyzed, and it seems to make sense to me. Another thing I'd like to say is if Scott is arguing along the lines of he thinks that something can come into existence, or if he's going to deny that principle and offer some kind of alternative like an acausal beginning ex nihilo, I want to propose a counter argument to that and say that beginning to exist acausally ex nihilo is logically incoherent. Because when we think of absolutely nothing, there's no potentiality for any particular X to begin to exist. Yet, if something begins to exist acausally ex nihilo, there is a potentiality. So that's the contradiction. How can a singularity just pop into existence acausally unless there is a potentiality? But absolute nothing has no potentiality for anything to happen. So there's a contradiction. I think it's logically incoherent to say there is a potentiality, there is no potentiality for X to begin to exist. Now, if you say that anything, if you would deny that there is a potentiality for just anything to happen, then I think you go back into William Lane Craig's objection. Well, why doesn't just anything begin to exist ex nihilo? So, I mean, I'm not sure how you could really get out of this in a way that makes sense. So, I'm arguing that a causal beginning to exist ex nihilo is logically incoherent. And I think you're misunderstanding what William Lane Craig or anybody else means by when they say, well, why doesn't just anything begin to exist? Your way out of this is to say, well, the universe exists. And that's not what we're saying. That's not what we're saying. We're not saying, well, why doesn't just anything happen in the universe ex nihilo? We're not saying that. Because, of course, there's the laws of the universe. They're going to kind of determine what happens in the universe. But that says absolutely nothing about what happens outside of the universe. Okay, a singularity appeared, and here we have our universe. But this doesn't bar anything else from happening externally to the universe ex nihilo. Why isn't there some unknown X that happens external to the universe, and it forces an interaction between our universe and that unknown X? I mean, there's nothing barring that. The only thing you're saying is, well, our universe bars things from happening inside of it. Well, so what? That doesn't bar anything from happening externally to it. You know, there could be why isn't our universe just being flooded with some bizarre unknown event? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know, but I don't think that cuts it. I think that's kind of that's not what we mean. You know, we're not referring to why doesn't just anything happen that violates the laws of nature. We're saying, why doesn't something else happen externally ex nihilo to our universe that forces an interaction between our universe and that unknown thing? So I don't think you've really answered that objection by pointing to the laws of our universe. That's not what we're talking about. Anyways, I just wanted to post this video I was going to make a counter argument with dualism, and Scott knows what I'm talking about. I don't feel I have to. I feel like I can reduce this to just pure logic and just say that there's nothing logically impossible about an interaction producing some completely new substance. So God can interact with some X and produce a singularity. And an interaction does not falsify Creatio Ex Nihilo, because an interaction does not logically entail a rearrangement. And that's pretty much all I have to say in this video. All right, thank you.